Hello and welcome to another video. In this one I'll be talking about the upcoming summer offensive. And why do I say summer offensive? Because it is today the last day of spring, which means that the half a year the Ukrainians have been talking about a spring offensive, or even more actually. It's not happening. It's been delayed. They thought the weather was bad, they didn't receive their tanks equipment in time, their training didn't finish in time. All of these things got delayed, so now it's going to be a summer offensive. And this is what I have been saying from the very start. A spring offensive is an idiotic idea because of the weather. I said it from the first day. They talked about it. They said, we're going to launch a spring offensive. I said, no, it's not going to happen. They said, Russia's going to launch a spring offensive. They said, Ukraine's going to launch a spring offensive. Neither happened because the spring weather is terrible weather for any offensive. And his invasion going backwards on the ground, Vladimir Putin is digging his forces in for the winter to await a new Russian offensive in the spring. So what he's saying is that throughout the winter, Russia will be dug in, they'll be holding defensive positions, they will not be attacking, and they'll wait until the spring before they start attacking.
Yeah, because we all know that when the ground is frozen and solid, it's the worst time to attack with mechanized formations. The best time is when the enemy doesn't expect it, when you're in mud, right? This is the best.
So what is currently happening? Today is the 31st of May. It's the last day of spring. And today we're going to see nothing happening. Why? Because there is preparation for an offensive. It is not ready yet. And why is it not ready yet? Two things. First off, the weather's just stopped raining. So the sun is out. It's going to stop being muddy soon, but it's not yet. As soon as it stops being muddy, they don't have the weather as an excuse anymore. It's now the summer season. The sun is out. It's very warm. It's between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius during the day. There's no excuse not to launch an offensive. The second thing is that most of the equipment that they have requested is there. The only thing they don't have ready is the fighter jets. They're not going to receive those for this offensive. It'll be for the next one, if the war continues for so long. Anyways, so this means that essentially everything is ready. There's nothing holding them back except for the weather, and that's going to be done in a couple of days. So in conclusion, a Ukrainian offensive will happen in the next couple of weeks because they have everything prepared. And if they have everything prepared and they aren't going to launch it, then it's because they aren't going to launch it. Second option is that they will delay it significantly to the end of summer, or even to the winter, so that they will have the fighter jets, or generally the situation will be more in their favor. But so far it seems that the Russians are preparing for a Ukrainian offensive right now, as they are constantly launching missile strikes and drone strikes into the major urban areas of Ukraine to destroy the energy grid, critical military and civilian infrastructure in these areas, group movements, military deployments, equipment transports, and all of these other things, especially air defense systems. So something very interesting is that Ukraine has two types of air defense system. They have static and dynamic. The static is the ones like the Patriot system, that they are placed somewhere, they are not going to move, they're just going to be there. For example, in Kiev, they have the Patriot system there. And then we have other things like the dynamic or mobile air defense systems like the S-300, which are self-propelled. They can move by itself. It doesn't need anyone to transport it. And at the same time, they are constantly on the move. They're not at any static areas. So the S-300 system, according to the leaked documents we received a couple of months back, if that information is true, then they're running very low on those systems, which indicates that they are heavily relying on Western aid for air defense as well. And based on the aid that they've received so far, they haven't received a lot of mobile anti-air defense systems. So this indicates that in case the Ukrainians launch a offensive, then the Russians will have air superiority. The Ukrainians will not be able to contest the Russians in the air. This means that the Ukrainian offensive will which means that the success of the Ukrainian offensive will heavily rely on two things. One thing is how prepared Russia is. How do they have their planes ready? Do they have all of these things ready? and how effective is Ukraine's attack on Russian logistics. While the Russians are launching missile strikes and drone strikes every day on the major urban areas of Ukraine, the Ukrainians are launching drone strikes on oil refineries across Crimea and Rostov and Krasnodar and so on. And they are also launching drone strikes and Storm Shadow missile strikes on ammo depots and so on in Melitopol, Luhansk, and so on. So they're trying to attack the Russian supply lines, which means that they are trying to prepare for their own offensive through those means. If they manage to successfully disrupt the Russian supply lines and launch an offensive where the Russians are unprepared, then they will have major success. However, it seems that the Russians are prepared across the whole front line. They are now mobilizing the Chechen forces, sending them to the Donbas region, where they don't expect a Ukrainian offensive, combining that with the Russian forces who are already there, and with the Wagner forces who are just leaving to prepare for the next phase. The Russian forces will have the Donbas region under control. Then we have the Zaporizhia and Kreminna areas. In the Svatove-Kreminna area, the Russian forces there have a lot of forces. They have 2 tank divisions, they have other units. It is very well fortified and heavily armed, equipped, a lot of troops there. As for the Zaporizhia front, they have a lot of layers of defense. They have a lot of units. They have a lot of supplies. Everything is ready there as well. Which means that generally on the whole front line, across the whole front line here in the south, the Russians are ready to dispel any Ukrainian offensive. So we have to see, okay, what exactly will Ukraine do? What are they planning to do? Where will they plan to do it? How are they preparing to do it? And so on. So, first off, when will it happen? I expect in the next 1 to 2 weeks, or it will be significantly delayed. How will it happen? It will happen where the Ukrainian forces gather a large contingency of troops armed with Western weapons and Western trade personnel, as well as a combined arms operation, where they will send drone strikes to launch armored columns, and they will try to storm and break through Russian defensive lines. Where will it happen? It will happen where the Russians are weakest. What does that mean? It means that the Ukrainians know that the Russians are heavily fortified across the whole front line. So it will be very difficult for them to succeed, especially with their lack of air superiority or presence at all within the air zone. So with this, they know, okay, we have to have the largest possible advantage. And where do they have the largest possible advantage? They have it wherever the Russian forces are weakest. And how do we determine where they are weakest? We have to determine exactly what area would be difficult to resupply and send reinforcements to in case the Ukrainians break through, and where is it easy for the Ukrainians to break through. So we know the Russian forces have multiple layers of defense within the Zaporizhia front. And in the Donetsk region, we see that there's major urban areas as well as heavily fortified areas here as well. And then finally, which areas are the easiest to resupply? The further east you go, the easier it is for Russians to send reinforcements, and the further west you go, the more difficult it is. So based on this information, we can see that the weakest place on the front line is by the Mariupol area. Here to northwest of Mariupol, the Russian defensive lines are significantly stretched around the Melitopol and Berdyansk area, as well as by Tokmak and so on, by the general front line of Zaporizhia. The Russian forces have heavy units of heavy concentration of forces by the Donetsk region, which means that if they want to send reinforcements, they will have to pull this extra burden on their supply lines. And at the same time, if the Ukrainian forces manage to capture this area right here in between Donetsk and Melitopol, that is where they'll have the largest advantage, as they'll be able to cut off the main supply route towards Melitopol. So essentially, the area that I predict is the weakest link in the Russian defensive line is the area south of Uledar in the direction of Mariupol. It is also fairly close to the Russian areas. Rostov. Russian forces can just send reinforcements straight from Rostov to Mariupol, and then they'll be able to probably supply and reinforce this area. However, it could be something in the direction of advancing southwards in the direction of Mariupol, and then moving westward towards Berdyansk, and then moving westwards and flanking the Russian positions to the south. So rather than going in the direction of Mariupol, going westwards after they have gone southwards. So south and then to the west to try and take control over Melitopol from weaker areas, weaker defensive positions. However, this distance is very large. So unless they have some major success where they have and cover hundreds of kilometers a day, they completely bypass Russian minefields. The Russian forces are completely unprepared and are unable to send reinforcements to the front line. In that case, they may be able to succeed in this. So essentially what we're seeing is that the Ukrainian forces are in a position where their only solutions are very risky ones, because the Russian forces have prepared that much more than in comparison to the fall of last year, where they essentially were very thinly stretched across the whole front line. They barely had any troops in the Kharkiv region. They had a lot of focus on the Kherson region, but that was across a bridgehead. They had poor supply lines. At the same time, the Russian forces were constantly being bombarded and their supplies were running low. In comparison, here we see that the Russian forces are well supplied, well trained, well equipped, large numbers, fortified positions. There's so many things that has changed, and generally the forecast for a Ukrainian offensive looks very dim. It's very difficult to see how the Ukrainians will succeed. Of course, their level of equipment and so on has significantly increased since the last offensive. However, they still do not have artillery superiority, they don't have firepower superiority, they don't have air superiority. It's very difficult for them to gain major success from this, to the point that even the Ukrainians are expecting that it will only be limited success. The Russians are expecting it to be limited success. The West are expecting it to be limited success. However, something to note about that is when the general consensus is that it will be limited success, it could be one of two things. Either that it's very clear and obvious the Ukrainians do not have enough forces to do so, or the Ukrainians are trying to look weaker than they actually are, and they actually have a lot more planned, they have a lot more equipped, they have a lot more ready for this offensive than anyone knows, which could allow them to achieve major success in comparison. So that is the general idea of what this upcoming offensive will look like, and that is my expectations, and that is going to be all for this video. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.